is three requests for emergency debates, and the first one being from the Leader of the Opposition regarding the Keystone XL pipeline, and the Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The first day of return of Parliament, we should address two items that are in our national interest in the middle of a healthcare crisis and an economic crisis. The first is Keystone XL. We are in a jobs crisis, Mr. Speaker. Our economic recovery from COVID-19 depends on vaccines, a plan to get back to work. That requires investments and projects to create jobs in every sector of this country and in every region of this country, Mr. Speaker. In recent days, our country has been dealt a serious blow by the new Biden administration with their executive order cancelling the Keystone XL pipeline. Pas de consultation avec notre...
Our government was not consulted. What of special relations with our country, Mr. Speaker?
Order is a mistake. Keystone represents a major strategic energy corridor that will enhance North American energy independence away from authoritarian regimes. The project has the potential for tens of thousands of well-paid, unionized jobs both in Canada and the United States. Le rejet de Keystone serait un coup.
Not having Keystone go ahead would be a hard hit for our economic recovery, Mr. Speaker, not only in the West, but everywhere in Canada.
Attacking our energy industry. It is time for this government to defend our ethical oil that partners with Indigenous communities to the tune of over $1 billion per year. Keystone was designed with the highest environmental standards to achieve net zero emissions by 2030. Its rejection would actually result in 28 to 42% higher CO2 emissions via rail shipments. We must secure our future. We must secure jobs in every sector and in every region of the country. For the sake of Canada-US relations, our economic recovery, our environment, we need to get Keystone built. We need to get Canadians back to work. The Prime Minister must stand up for Canadian workers and ask the incoming administration to reverse their executive order. This project is in our national interest and will help tens of thousands of families struggling amid this health and economic crisis. Therefore, Mr. Speaker, we respectfully request an emergency debate to drive towards a plan to save this project.
I thank the Honourable Member for Durham for his intervention. I'm prepared to grant an emergency debate concerning Keystone XL pipeline. The debate will be held later this evening at the ordinary hour of daily adjournment. The next intervention, the Honourable Member or Leader of the Opposition.
Well, first, Mr. Speaker, may I rise to thank you for your previous decision with respect to Keystone XL. Thousands of Canadian families appreciate your willingness to show the importance of this project. But, Mr. Speaker, our country, as I said in my previous remarks, is facing a crisis of historic proportions. Nearly 20,000 Canadians have died of COVID-19 in the last 10 months. 10% des Canadiens ont perdu.
10% of Canadians have lost their jobs. Thousands of businesses have closed their doors.
Not enough. Canadians are facing a range of pandemic side effects. Some 2/5 of Canadian workers are worried about their colleagues' mental health. Thousands of cancer operations have been delayed. And in British Columbia, weak enforcement is leading to 60% more deaths from the opioid epidemic than from COVID-19. Ce gouvernement n'a pas un plan clair.
The government does not have a clear plan, which has serious repercussions.
To protecting Canadians, and that is ensuring a smooth and reliable vaccine rollout. The ability for our country to rebuild our economy, to get Canadians back to work in every sector and in every region, depends on a smooth vaccine rollout. Conservatives want the government to succeed, Mr. Speaker, because our nation depends on it. Unfortunately, despite the Prime Minister's assurances, the Pfizer vaccine's delivery is now in jeopardy. Premiers report they have run out or are soon to run out of vaccines. What will happen if Thousands of hospitals and healthcare administrators administer a first dose, but procurement problems delay the ability for the second. There are so many questions outstanding, Mr. Speaker, despite the government's claims to have a plan. We wish we could just trust the Prime Minister here, Mr. Speaker, but the situation demands Parliament's urgent attention. On ne peut pas laisser nos
We cannot let our hospitals become overwhelmed.
To improve the government's approach on vaccines. The health and safety of all Canadians is at stake. And without our health and safety, Mr. Speaker, we cannot secure our future, rebuild our economy, and get Canadians back to work. We need to round the corner in the COVID-19 crisis to get life back to normal. We only do that with vaccines. In a week where we're seeing new strains and the highest rates of infection ever, we're having 0 vaccines delivered, Mr. Speaker. That is a national crisis. It's a national failure, and it deserves the urgent attention of Parliament through another emergency debate. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Before ruling on that intervention, I believe the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway has an intervention on that very same topic. The honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On behalf of my fellow New Democrats, I also rise to propose an emergency debate regarding COVID-19 pandemic and vaccine distribution. You know, New Democrats and Conservatives don't often agree, but we agree fundamentally on this issue. And I think it's telling that when you have the official opposition and the opposition New Democrats, which make up a very high percentage of members of this House, agreeing on the importance of this emergency debate, I think that should be highly persuasive to you, Mr. Speaker. I think I speak for all parliamentarians, Mr. Speaker, when I say that Canadians are extremely concerned about the impact that delayed shipments of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine will have on Canada's vaccination schedule. This interruption will further delay vaccination for Canada's highest risk populations, because that's who we're starting our vaccination programs with, at a time when COVID-19 cases are surging. And in addition, highly contagious COVID-19 variants are spreading across Canada, some from Britain, some from South Africa. Indeed, every day that COVID-19 vaccine rollout is delayed will result in avoidable infections and death. Mr. Speaker, last week, the United States administered an average of 1.16 million vaccine doses per day. As of yesterday, Canada had only administered an overall total of 816,557 vaccine doses. The Public Health Agency of Canada's latest modelling projects that Canada is on track to hit 10,000 new daily cases by February. That's only in a short week. Canada remains on a rapid growth trajectory with widespread community transmission and increased outbreaks in long-term care facilities across our country. Canadian labs have now detected about 24 cases of highly contagious COVID-19 variants in our country so far. Data from the UK suggests that its variant is 50% more transmissible person to person than the common strain. And last week, Mr. Speaker, Major General Danny Fortin, the military commander overseeing vaccine logistics for the Public Health Agency of Canada, confirmed that Canada will only receive about 1/3 of expected deliveries to February 7th, 2021. That's 2 weeks from now. So we know that Canada is set to receive no new deliveries of doses this week and only 79,000 doses in the first week of February. The European Union will have a much shorter interruption in deliveries than Canada, despite assurances from the federal government that countries will be impacted equally by supply reductions. While Canada will receive 0 doses this week, Pfizer has just confirmed that it will be back to the original schedule of deliveries to the European Union beginning the week of January 25th, where we get none. Finally, Mr. Speaker, there was some alarming news out of the European Union just today that they may be seeking export restrictions on all vaccines produced in Europe because they are concerned that they may not have enough vaccines in Europe. So while this government has assured us that the current vaccine interruption by Pfizer is temporary, we actually have evidence and signs that there may be further production or export disruptions in the future. Mr. Speaker, there is no more important issue to all parliamentarians and Canadians than their health. We are in the middle of a global pandemic, and vaccines, as the leader of the official opposition just stated, are our way to get control of this problem. I can't think of a more important issue to have an emergency debate on than vaccine distribution in Canada, and I hope that you will grant this very reasonable and an emergency request. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I thank the honourable member for Durham and the honourable member for Vancouver Kingsway for their interventions. I'm prepared to grant an emergency debate concerning vaccine supply. This debate will be held later tomorrow at the ordinary hour of daily adjournment. Orders of the day.
Orders of the day. Ordre émanant du gouvernement. Projet de loi émanant du gouvernement. Commune. Reprise.
Government orders, government bills, resuming debate at second reading of C-14, Economic Statement Implementation Act 2020.
Prise du débat, the honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby has 7 minutes and 2 seconds remaining in his elocution. The honourable member.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to say that I think the fact that we will have the debate tomorrow on vaccine distribution will be extremely important. And I know that many parliamentarians from across the country will want to participate. Now, Mr. Speaker, before we rose for question period, I had raised issues with C-14, not in terms of content. Content is in a sense, a small step towards meeting the challenge of the pandemic. But in terms of what could have been in the bill and what could have been in the fall economic statement, and were not, Mr. Speaker, that is the real problem, I think, with C-14, not the content, but what is not in there. What could have been presented in the midst of the worst pandemic that Canada has experienced in a century, the worst economic crisis, certainly since the Second World War. Combining those two things, one would think that the fall economic statement and the bill that emerged from the fall economic statement would have really met the challenges that Canadian families are facing. And as you know, Mr. Speaker, even coming into the pandemic, Canadian families were beset and burdened with the heaviest level of family debt that exists among industrialized countries. The average Canadian family has more family debt than families in any other industrialized country. That is in part because of decisions made over the last couple of decades that have pushed Canadian families down, the unraveling of the social safety net, the emphasis on providing perks and tax holidays to the very wealthy and most profitable corporations rather than making the public investments that would make such a difference in the lives of Canadians. And then the pandemic hits, and Canadians are experiencing incredible challenges in my riding of New Westminster Burnaby and in every other corner of this country. Canadians are facing daily challenges to put food on the table, to keep a roof over their head. And yet, within Bill C-14, we don't see any bold attempt to really meet those challenges. And Mr. Speaker, it is indicative, I think, that the new American president, Joe Biden, within the span of his first 5 hours and the executive mandates that he signed, has proven to be more proactive in using government machinery to really work in the interests of the people than this government has in 5 years. 5 hours, 5 years. That is the real disappointment of the current Prime Minister and the current government. So what do we see in C-14? Well, instead of investments in building a national child care program that we know as we emerge hopefully from this pandemic in the next few months, that Canadian families will need that national network of universal child care. Instead of seeing those investments, there is scant support given to Canadian families. In terms of really dealing with the crisis in long-term care, instead of putting it under strict national standards and making sure that there's adequate funding for long-term care for our seniors. We see a small amount compared to what was given to the banking sector, but no real attempt to address the crisis that we're seeing in long-term care. And when we see the $750 billion in liquidity supports provided through a wide variety of federal institutions within days of the pandemic hitting, Mr. Speaker, $750 billion given to the banking sector. Now, government MPs might say, well, this was liquidity supports. It helps the banking sector. Banking sector so far in this pandemic has received profits of $30 billion. That should absolutely not have been the first objective of this government. But contrast that $750 billion with what people with disabilities who are struggling to keep a roof over their head, what they have actually received in supports. The NDP caucus went, and I've mentioned and raised this numerous times, as have other members of the NDP caucus, as has our leader, the member from Burnaby South. We have raised this numerous times, that it took not once or twice, but half a dozen fights to get a $600 payment, one-time payment paid to a minority of people with disabilities across the country. And yet we see, with alacrity, $750 billion going to the banking sector. And we see an interest rate holiday for students when they're struggling to pay for their student loans. Now, during this pandemic, Mr. Speaker, as I mentioned, the banking sector, $30 billion in profits. Canada's billionaires, over $50 billion in the pandemic added to their wealth. And yet, we see a government that steadfastly refuses to put in place what the member from Burnaby South and the NDP caucus has called for. And the vast majority of Canadians, when they're asked in public opinion, say the same thing, that we need to put in place a wealth tax. We need to put in place a pandemic profits tax. We had those measures in the Second World War. It meant that we were all in this together. And it also meant that the federal government had the wherewithal to ensure that Canadians had the investments they needed as we emerged out of the Second World War. We brought this forward in the House, as you'll recall, Mr. Speaker, along with provisions for guaranteed livable basic income, a right to housing and universal pharmacare, and government members voted against those measures, despite the fact that they are supported by the vast majority of Canadians. Now, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, next month, the parliamentarians will have a second chance on universal publicly administered pharmacare because Bill C-213 will be voted on in less than a month. And of course, across the country, we've seen thousands of Canadians write to their members of parliament to say, vote yes on C-213. Above all, because in this pandemic, with the number of Canadians that have lost their drug coverage, 10 million Canadians have no access to the medication that their doctors prescribe as necessary. So there'll be a second chance for that, Mr. Speaker, and a second chance for the government to actually bring forward the bold ideas that the NDP has been proposing in a budget that should be tabled this spring. Well, Mr. Speaker, I hope that the government will repair the mistake that they made in the fall and actually provide the supports that Canadians need. Merci beaucoup, Mr.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The honourable member raises a point that everyone saw. The problems in long-term care facilities in Quebec, the deaths within that network. It was catastrophic for families across Quebec, and we're seeing the same conditions, in fact, in many other regions of Canada. We need standards. We also need staff to deal with this chronic problem. We can't play politics on this issue. That's very clear. The government didn't put into place a system with standards and capacity with human resources to ensure that all seniors in Quebec and across Canada have the future that they deserve based on their contributions to society.
Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan. Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's clear to me that if we're going to get our economy moving again, a critical thing about getting that going, getting resources to people who need it, is creating jobs and opportunity, supporting workers and those who wish to become workers again. To that end, it was so disappointing for me to see the NDP basically cheerleading the canceling of Keystone XL pipeline and all the unionized jobs that were killed when that project was ended. So I wonder if the member from the NDP can explain for a political party that wants to be competitive, supposedly in Western Canada, that claims to speak on behalf of workers, why would they be cheerleading for the end of a project like Keystone XL that helped so many people, would have helped so many people get back to work, and would have been so good for the Canadian economy?
Honourable member for New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And unlike the member, I actually come from the oil and gas industry, worked at the Shelburne oil refinery in Burnaby, British Columbia. So I know the industry well. And I know that there have been countless resources. This is the most heavily subsidized, in many cases, when you look at oil and gas subsidies, one of the most heavily subsidized industries in Canada. And so I care about energy workers because I come from that environment. And what we've seen under both Conservative and Liberal governments is an utter refusal to allow the resources to energy workers to transition to a clean energy future. That's where the jobs are, of course. We've seen President Joe Biden take leadership in that regard. And we know, because the building trades tell us, unionized workers tell us, that the clean energy industry and imports from Canada of clean energy will quadruple over the next 9 years. Now, with that massive increase in imports from Canada of clean energy, why would we not put in place the resources so that those energy workers who have made such an enormous contribution to the energy sector can transition to clean energy? That's where the future is. That's where the jobs are. And that's what the NDP is cheerleading. Clean energy resources, investments, so that we can provide the jobs to energy workers in what is the emerging economy, the clean energy sector of tomorrow.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Member for Saanich Gulf Islands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to my honourable colleague from New Westminster Burnaby. The speech was, of course, for him a while ago because he began it before question period began. I want to pause to say how very nice it is to see all of us friends gathered together, even if only by Zoom, and thank the Speaker for the chance to pose this question. I was taken by the honourable member's comments on the impacts of the Spanish flu and how long those impacts stayed with society. A personal point, my namesake, Elizabeth Evans Stevens, was a victim of the Spanish flu, and I can say that the intergenerational impacts of losing a young mother not only affected my grandmother, but my mother. This is a pandemic, the likes of which we haven't seen for generations, and its effects will be intergenerational. But my very strong support for the honourable member's speech is to his points on the banking industry, with their extraordinary levels of profits, over $30 billion in profits through the pandemic. And yet this very industry is leaning on small business. In my own area, Wilson's Bus Lines is at risk of going under, not because the government programs that are on offer don't really meet their needs. Bus companies and other companies across Canada are at risk because these banks that have been raking in profits and have had government help seem to think they're not Canadian. They don't think they're part of our national effort to save businesses and save jobs. And I wonder if my honourable colleague has any comments on what this government should be doing to ensure that the banks don't push good, essential companies like Wilson's Bus Lines into bankruptcy.
For New Westminster Burnaby.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member and wish her a happy New Year and thank her for the question. Yeah, this is what is inconceivable to me. $750 billion given in liquidity supports to Canadian banking industry and not any conditions whatsoever. We saw credit unions stepping forward and lowering their interest rates to zero. We saw credit unions stepping up and providing, in some cases, what was required around the suspending the payment of mortgages and yet not imposing penalties. The banking industry didn't have any conditions at all imposed, and the result has been windfall profits of $30 billion and real pressure on businesses like Wilson's and others across the country. We need to take the best practices of other countries. Other countries said, well, if we're providing supports, there are going to be conditions. This government stepped up within days of the pandemic hitting. Their first thought was, let's help the banking industry. And $750 billion later, the banking industry is reaping massive profits. And so many Canadians and so many small businesses are struggling. And of course, with the Spanish flu, we know that the implications, the consequences will last for more than a decade for lower income families. The reality is the fall economic statement actually talks about cutbacks starting in next fiscal year, dramatic cutbacks over the next 13 months. We need this government to rethink its approach, and we're willing to work with it.
Just going to have time for one more question. The honourable member for Cowichan, Malahat, Langford.
Thank you so much, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from New Westminster, Burnaby, and I'll also congratulate him on Bill C-213, because I think it's a perfect example of us once again taking Liberal promises and putting them into NDP action. I listened very attentively to his speech, and he's very right. It's not so much what's in Bill C-14, but what's missing. And for me, a particular issue that affects the city of Langford in my riding is a startup business, V2V Black Hops Brewery, who did not have their payroll account in place before March 15th. And here we are 10 months into the pandemic. They are still unable to qualify for the emergency wage subsidy. So perhaps my colleague, in his role as critic for finance and the incredible work he's done with the member for Courtenay Alberni, can answer the question as to why, after all this time, Liberals are still excluding startups from accessing this important wage subsidy, because so many of them are struggling, and indeed, I fear many are going to go out of business. Thank you.
Honourable member for New Westminster, Burnaby.
I thank the member from Cowichan, Malahat, Langford. He's an incredibly strong advocate for small businesses in his riding. I know this. I've seen it firsthand. And this is just another example. V2V Black Ops Brewery, not getting the supports that they need. But if you're one of the big banks, you're awash in cash. The federal government says you are the priority. And this is why the NDP caucus has been so persistent. The member from Courtenay Alberni is our small business critic, and I know the member from Cowichan, Malahat, Langford as well, and all of the NDP caucus in ensuring small businesses get some supports. And we're not there yet, but we're going to continue to push, because this government needs to be thinking of regular families across the country and small businesses across the country, and stop its obsession with the most profitable businesses and the largest banks.
Thank the honourable members. And before we get to the next speaker, just a reminder, perhaps those who are joining by video conference. Earlier in the day, we had some difficulties with the raise hand function on Zoom. Administration tells us that at the moment that's working fine. So please use that same tool that we have used in the past. However, if any encounter any difficulties, or if you think that you are being missed, please bring a point of order to me, and we'll make sure that we get you recognized. Merci encore. La prochaine députée.
Thank you again. Resuming debate, the Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm going to assume that you can hear me. I know there were some difficulties a little bit earlier today. What a pleasure it is to be able to address the House of Commons, whether it's standing inside the chamber or sitting in a home. It's always such a privilege to be able to share some thoughts and some ideas, and try as best I can to provide a little bit of constructive criticism here and there. I like to think that part of my job is ensuring that there's a higher sense of accountability, even coming from our opposition parties. And I hope to be able to address a number of points. First and foremost, Mr. Speaker, as we all know, life has really changed over the last 12 months for all of us in a very real and tangible way. I never would have figured I would be addressing, for example, the House of Commons via the internet, and what I'm saying being recorded as if I was standing on the floor of the House. Everyone, it doesn't matter what one's economic, social strata is. Lives have changed, and profoundly so, Mr. Speaker, because of the worldwide pandemic. And I do believe that we have seen so many phenomenal efforts come forward from many different sectors of our economy and our society. And I wanted just to recognize right up front, over the last number of weeks, our holidays, whether one celebrates Christmas or Hanukkah or one of the many other different types of celebrations that often take place during our Christmas period, it was really different. It was different in the sense, I know from my province and many others across this land, we weren't able to have those gatherings, people coming together, families being able to come together. But it didn't stop people from communicating. The pandemic meant, yes, that you had to have physical distancing. Didn't mean that we had to separate that communication link to those very important relationships in our lives. And whether it's with family, friends, or in my case, and the case of many of my colleagues, our constituents. The constituents that I represent in Winnipeg North have just done a fantastic job in terms of communicating with me. And whether it's through telephone calls at my constituency office, emails, letters, Zoom discussions, telephone discussions, there's all sorts of ways in which we've been able to communicate. And, I don't think time would allow me to provide the type of feedback, ideas, and recommendations and concerns that people have raised to me over the last number of months, and wanting to be able to, as much as possible, share it on the floor of the House of Commons, so that all parliamentarians will, in fact, have a sense of what the residents of Winnipeg North are thinking. And I can tell you, Mr. Speaker, that there is a higher sense of hope in my constituents' mind today than there would have been months ago. The delivery of vaccines has been very important to my constituents. And, I listen intently to a number of comments that are coming from, in particular, opposition members. And I think that if we were to do a fair comparison, that you will find that Canada has done exceptionally well on that front. And I say that without any reservations whatsoever. As a government, we've had numerous ministers on that particular file, and they have worked exceptionally hard at ensuring that Canada can be very proud of the vaccination agreements that we have been able to achieve in order to protect the health and well-being of Canadians from coast to coast, Mr. Speaker. I believe there is some common threads that have come from the constituents in which I represent. One of them is the desire to see partisan politics as much as possible, and many of you will know that I at times can be somewhat partisan. They want to see governments working together. They want to see that Team Canada approach in terms of making sure that the health and well-being of Canadians is being dealt with as a top priority. And I know from the Prime Minister's office to ministers to members of the House of Commons that we have all put in that extra effort to ensure that there is a higher sense of cooperation amongst the many, many different stakeholders that are out there. And when I talk about stakeholders, it goes far beyond just the Government of Canada. You know, whether you have to look at in our communities, and I think of social enterprise groups, I think of nonprofits, and the many fine works that they have done, Mr. Speaker, at ensuring that they are contributing in a positive way. Our individual constituents, in whatever way they can, they have been able to contribute. You think of the our first responders, in particular our healthcare workers, to our bus drivers, to those that are driving taxis. These people have made a difference and ensured that we have been able to get through this to the date in such a way in which we can continue on and feel that sense of optimism today. And to all of those individuals, I do express my appreciation. I believe that as a government, the government of Canada, with the leadership of our Prime Minister, has ensured that there is a sense of commitment that's coming from not only the national government, but the provincial governments, municipal governments, and even our school boards. All elected officials, as leaders in our community, have an important role to play on this issue, and it makes a difference. You know, when I was back in Ottawa in late November, Manitoba wasn't doing that well in terms of the coronavirus. The number of new cases being reported on a daily basis, I believe back towards the end of November, in fact, we were on a per capita base, we might have been the worst in the country. But it shows that if Ottawa, in support of our provinces and the provinces making good decisions, that we can in fact bring those numbers down. And today we are under 100. In fact, just over this last weekend, we saw many of the restrictions actually being lifted. So after many of my constituents, for example, had limitations in terms of what it is that they might be able to buy at the local store, many of those restrictions have been lifted. Why? Because Manitobans have, as Canadians as a whole, recognized that we all have a role to play in terms of us getting out of this current situation that we are in. And that brings me back to some of the comments that were made by some of my colleagues. The speaker prior NDP representative talked about the Liberals giving the banks as if they were our first priority. What a bunch of not truths, Mr. Speaker. At the end of the day, the Liberal Party doesn't put the banks ahead of Canadians, of real Canadians. We know all one has to do is just take a look at the types of actions the Government of Canada had taken back when action was needed. You know, the CERB program, and it's a program that I talk a great deal about. The CERB program, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit Program, I believe embodies many of the things that a government can actually do that will make a positive difference for Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Let's take a look at the details of that particular program. Virtually from nothing, there was no CERB program in its existence prior to the COVID-19. With the support of world-class civil servants, and we should be very proud of our civil servants and the fine work that they do, they put together a program that ultimately served over 8 million Canadians. Actually, I believe it's just under 9 million Canadians, Mr. Speaker. That is something in which all of us should be very proud of and not shy to talk about. That tells me, in terms of priority, why this government was so focused at the very beginning, sending a message to Canadians that we have your back, that we will be there for Canadians, no matter where they live in the country. And the CERB program, I believe, is one of those programs that clearly demonstrates that government can not only talk about caring for its citizens in which it represents, but it can demonstrate a tangible action. Hundreds of millions going into billions of dollars through a fantastic program that came from nowhere and ultimately put that money, that disposable income, into the pockets of Canadians from coast to coast to coast. Think about it, Mr. Speaker. Had the government not done it back then, what would have been the outcome of it? You know, you would have had more people having to borrow more money because of loss of income. You would have had people not being able to pay for basic groceries, their rent bills, their mortgage bills, buying the things that were essential for them, whether it's a single person or their family members. That's hundreds of millions throughout our country put into the pockets of these people so that they have the disposable income to be